It's been the worst time of my life, Joe. If somebody accused me of raping them or hurting them, I have a 22-year-old daughter. I would never hurt anyone.
Some careers end with headlines. Others end quietly, in the space between what a courtroom decides and what an industry chooses to believe. Clifton Powell's story lives in that space. He was never convicted of crime. The courts cleared him, and yet for years, Hollywood treated him like a man already sentenced. This is the story of how that happened, and how he kept working anyway. Ask most people who Clifton Powell is, and you'll get a blank look. Show them his face, and the recognition is instant. That's the strange kind of fame that comes with being a character actor. The kind of actor whose work fills the gaps between the stars, whose presence makes a scene feel real, even when nobody in the theater knows his name. Powell built that career the hard way, over more than 30 years and well over 100 film and television credits. He became the actor directors called when they needed someone who could walk into a scene and own it without needing a single line of introduction. A hustler, a father, a preacher, a criminal, a friend. He could be terrifying in one film and warmly comic in the next. And audiences never questioned the shift, because he made both versions of himself believable. His breakout came in 1993 with Menace to Society, a film that didn't flinch from showing the realities of urban life in a way mainstream Hollywood rarely allowed. Powell's performance stood out in a movie full of raw, unpolished talent, and it opened doors. Soon he was appearing in the Friday franchise, trading comic timing with some of the biggest names in black comedy, proving he wasn't just a dramatic actor. He could make people laugh just as easily as he could make them uneasy. By 2004, he had reached a new peak. In Ray, the Oscar-winning biopic of Ray Charles starring Jamie Foxx, Powell played Jeff Brown, Charles's road manager, a role that required restraint, loyalty, and quiet authority rather than the flash he'd often been asked to bring elsewhere. The performance earned him an NAACP Image Award nomination, a recognition that meant something different than box office numbers. It meant the industry, or at least part of it, was willing to see him as more than a supporting piece of scenery. Along the way came Dead Presidents, Rush Hour, Next Friday, Why Do Fools Fall in Love, and dozens of other titles, television guest spots, and direct-to-video releases that kept his name circulating steadily through the industry, even when it never made the marquee. Powell wasn't chasing stardom in the traditional sense. He was building something more durable, a reputation as a professional, reliable hand, an actor other actors and directors could count on. What the audience saw on screen was only half the story. Behind it was a man shaped by a childhood that gave him very little room for softness. Powell was raised in Southeast Washington, D.C., in a neighborhood where poverty and violence were part of daily life for a lot of kids his age. He lost his mother when he was 4 years old, and the father who raised him afterwards struggled with alcoholism, leaving young Clifton to find stability wherever he could, in mentors, in extended family, in his own stubborn determination not to be swallowed by the same streets that claimed so many of his peers. That kind of early loss doesn't just disappear once success arrives. It tends to follow a person quietly into adulthood, showing up in the way they build relationships, the way they handle stress, the way they respond when the ground shifts beneath them. For Powell, it showed up in his marriage. He married Kimberly Powell, and for a time the two of them built what looked from the outside like a stable family life. But the demands of an acting career, the travel, the unpredictable schedules, the sheer amount of time spent away from home, put a strain on the marriage that eventually became too much to bear. The relationship ended in divorce, and Powell has been open about how costly that ending was, both emotionally and financially. He's spoken about losing millions of dollars in the process, a blow that came at a stage in life when a lot of his peers were thinking about retirement, not rebuilding. He's also been candid about his own role in the marriage's collapse. In interviews, he's admitted that his devotion to work and the pull of the lifestyle that came with fame left him absent during years his children needed him. He said plainly that being away half the time might have been survivable for the family, but being away most of the time was not. It's a rare kind of honesty from someone in his position, an acknowledgement that success and presence aren't the same thing, and that he'd let one crowd out the other for longer than he should have. There were other struggles, too. Powell has talked openly about a gambling habit that, at its heaviest, cost him tens of thousands of dollars a year. Money spent chasing a feeling rather than building anything lasting. He's talked about being surrounded, during that period, by people who wanted access to his money and his name more than they wanted anything real from him. It's a familiar story in entertainment circles, but familiar doesn't make it less painful when you're the one living it. Powell has described that stretch of his life as a kind of spiral, decisions that felt good in the moment, compounding into problems that took years to untangle. By his own account, there was a real gap between the man audiences saw on screen and the man living his actual life. On camera, he was commanding, funny, larger than life. At home, he was somebody working through a divorce, a gambling problem, and the guilt of having missed pieces of his children's childhoods that he could never get back. That gap between public image and private struggle is worth holding on to because it's exactly the kind of gap that made him vulnerable to what came next. In the late summer of 2011, a woman came forward with a serious accusation against Clifton Powell. Using the pseudonym Keontae Myers in public statements, she alleged that an encounter with Powell in a New Orleans hotel room had started consensually but had turned aggressive, and that he had ignored her when she asked him to stop. She was, at the time, working as a cocktail waitress at Harrah's Casino. The story moved fast. Outlets covering celebrity news picked it up almost immediately, running it in the kind of blunt, attention-grabbing headlines that leave little room for nuance, context, or the presumption of innocence. For Powell, the shift was immediate and brutal. The same face that had made people laugh in Friday and had moved people in Ray was now attached to one of the most serious kinds of accusation a person can face. Powell denied the allegation from the very beginning, and he denied it without hedging. Through his representatives, he issued a statement calling the accusation false and said he intended to pursue every legal option available to him against his accuser. That's an important detail because it tells you something about how Powell chose to respond. Not with silence, not with a quiet settlement, but with an open denial and a stated willingness to fight the claim in court. The initial criminal investigation into the allegation did not result in charges. Prosecutors reviewed the case and found insufficient evidence to move forward. In a strictly legal sense, that should have been close to the end of the story. An accusation was made, it was investigated, and it did not meet the threshold required to bring criminal charges. But that's not how public perception works, and it's not how Hollywood works either. The headlines from the initial accusation didn't get walked back just because charges weren't filed. And the story wasn't actually over. Myers went on to file a civil lawsuit against Powell, seeking damages in excess of $75,000. That meant Powell, despite facing no criminal charges, was now looking at years of continued legal entanglement, a fight that would consume his time, his money, and his emotional bandwidth long after most people assumed the matter had been settled. It's worth pausing here to understand something about how civil cases differ from criminal ones, because it explains a lot about what Powell went through next. In a criminal trial, the standard is beyond a reasonable doubt, about as high a bar as the legal system sets. In a civil case, the standard is much lower, a preponderance of the evidence, meaning the question is simply whether it's more likely than not that the claim is true. That difference matters enormously for public figures because it means an accusation can clear the much lower bar of a civil case, or simply survive long enough to keep generating headlines, without ever coming close to meeting the standard required for an actual criminal conviction. Powell has spoken about this dynamic directly, saying that the hardest part of the ordeal wasn't the legal process itself. It was watching the erosion of trust around him, feeling work dry up, and realizing that a lot of people had already reached their own verdict long before any court had ruled on anything. That's exactly what happened. The impact on his career was fast and tangible. Roles that had already been secured started disappearing. Producers who might have normally reached out to him grew hesitant, unwilling to risk the negative press that could come from being associated with an actor under a cloud of allegation, whether or not that allegation had been proven. Powell has described specific instances of this, a television role he expected to appear in for 7 or 8 episodes that quietly ended after 2, with no real explanation given beyond the obvious one hanging in the air. The financial losses were real, but Powell has said the emotional toll was heavier. He's described that period as among the most painful of his life, comparable in weight to losing his father years earlier. As a father himself, he found the accusation especially difficult to carry, not just because of what it implied about him, but because of how it might shape the way his own children saw him. He maintained his innocence throughout, but innocence doesn't insulate a person's family from public whispers. He's talked about walking down the street and feeling the weight of strangers' assumptions, about anonymous comments online treating him as guilty before any court had weighed in at all. That's the part of Powell's experience that's easy to miss if you only look at the legal outcome. In an industry where public perception often carries more real-world consequence than a legal verdict, Powell had effectively been sentenced by public opinion, years before the actual courts had their say. The civil case dragged on. For 4 years, Powell lived with it hanging over him, trying to keep both his career and his personal life intact while the legal process moved at its own slow pace. Finally, in 2017, the case was dismissed for insufficient evidence. The following year, in 2018, Powell's own countersuit for defamation and emotional distress was also dismissed, closing the matter entirely. On paper, that's a clean resolution. No criminal charges, no successful civil claim against him, no finding of wrongdoing at any point in the process. But Powell has been honest about the fact that being cleared legally didn't mean being restored professionally. The years the case consumed were years he couldn't get back. Years of momentum, of roles, of the kind of steady work that had defined his career up to that point. He walked away from the legal process without a conviction, but not without a cost. This is where the deeper truth of Powell's story lives, and it's a more complicated truth than a simple headline can capture. He was never found guilty of anything. The criminal investigation went nowhere. The civil case was dismissed. By every legal measure available, Clifton Powell was cleared. And yet the years surrounding that accusation cost him real, measurable ground in his career. Roles, relationships with producers, the kind of trust that takes decades to build and can evaporate in a news cycle. In an industry that runs on image and perception as much as it runs on talent, an accusation alone can function as its own kind of sentence, regardless of what a courtroom ultimately decides. Powell's case is a sharp illustration of that imbalance. The presumption of innocence exists in law, but it doesn't always survive contact with public opinion, especially when a story is sensational enough to travel faster than the facts that eventually catch up to it. That's not a story about guilt. It's a story about how reputational damage and legal innocence can exist in the same life at the same time, pulling in opposite directions. Powell's career was shaped by more than just the fallout from a single accusation. He's also spoken candidly over the years about the racial dynamics that limited his opportunities long before 2011, barriers that had nothing to do with talent and everything to do with how Hollywood has historically cast black actors, and specifically darker-skinned black actors. He's described being told directly by producers and network executives that he was too dark for certain roles, that his complexion, not his ability, was the deciding factor in whether he'd be considered. In one particularly blunt instance, he recalled being told his skin tone might scare viewers. These weren't subtle implications. They were stated outright, treated as ordinary business reasoning rather than the discrimination they actually were. This is a pattern that has existed in the industry for generations. An unspoken hierarchy where lighter skin tones are treated as more relatable or marketable, particularly for roles requiring warmth, romance, or vulnerability, while darker-skinned actors are frequently funneled into narrower categories. The intimidating figure, the villain, the criminal. Powell experienced this firsthand. He was widely praised for his ability to play gritty, menacing characters, but when a role called for tenderness or emotional nuance, his skin tone was suddenly treated as a liability rather than an asset. That double standard didn't just limit the kinds of characters he got to play. It shaped how audiences perceive him more broadly, reinforcing exactly the kind of narrow, threatening image that made the 2011 allegation land as hard and as fast as it did. Powell didn't just experience this quietly. He's spoken publicly about the importance of solidarity within the Black entertainment community, criticizing the tendency of some public figures to tear each other down in mainstream press rather than supporting one another in an industry that already made success difficult enough. In one notable moment, he pushed back publicly after director Spike Lee made comments Powell felt were unnecessarily harsh toward a fellow Black actor, saying he didn't respect anyone, himself included, who would use crossover press to publicly diminish someone else in the community trying to make him the business. That stance says something about how Powell chose to carry himself through an industry that had, in various ways, worked against him. Rather than internalizing the industry's biases or turning them against others, he pushed back on the idea that Black entertainers should be competing by tearing each other down, arguing instead for a kind of mutual respect that the industry itself rarely modeled. His NAACP Image Award nomination for Ray carries extra weight against this backdrop. It wasn't just recognition for a single performance. It was one of the few moments where the industry's usual biases didn't dictate the outcome, where his work as Jeff Brown, alongside Jamie Foxx's Oscar-winning lead performance, was judged on its own merits rather than filtered through the kinds of assumptions that limited his other opportunities. What makes Powell's story different from a lot of Hollywood scandal narratives is what happened after the civil case was dismissed. There was no dramatic public comeback tour, no tell-all interview circuit designed to rehabilitate his image. Instead, Powell did what he'd always done. He kept working. He continued taking roles, continued showing up on set, continued being the actor directors could count on to deliver whatever the script demanded of him. It wasn't a flashy recovery. It was a steady one, built the same way his original career had been built, through consistency rather than spectacle. That steadiness is, in its own way, the most telling part of his story. Powell never got the dramatic public vindication that clears a person's name in the eyes of an entire industry overnight. What he got instead was time and the willingness to keep doing the work in front of him, film after film, without waiting for anyone's permission to move forward. He's continued to speak honestly when asked about the mistakes he made in his personal life, the gambling, the absence from his children during difficult years, the toll his choices took on his marriage. He hasn't tried to rewrite that part of his story into something more flattering. And he's continued to speak just as honestly about the accusation that nearly derailed his career, standing by his denial without wavering, even while acknowledging how much the ordeal cost him regardless of the eventual legal outcome. It would be easy to reduce Clifton Powell's story to a simple redemption arc or to flatten it into another tabloid headline about a Hollywood scandal. Neither version does justice to what actually happened. The more accurate story is messier and more instructive. It's the story of a man who grew up with very little stability and built, through decades of disciplined work, one of the most recognizable character actor careers in modern film. It's the story of real personal struggles, a costly divorce, a gambling problem, years of admitted absence from his own children's lives, that he's chosen to discuss honestly rather than hide. And it's the story of a serious accusation that never resulted in criminal charges and was ultimately dismissed in civil court, but that still managed to cost him years of career momentum simply by existing in the public conversation. That last part is the piece worth sitting with. Powell was never convicted of anything.